Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this policy and practice seminar hosted by the Center on U.S. Politics here at UCL School of Public Policy. My name is Thomas Gift. I'm director of the center, and I'm really delighted that all of you have joined us for what I know is going to be a fascinating and timely discussion on the upcoming U.S. midterms. America's elections are coming up next week, of course, and the outcome will determine not only which party controls the House and the Senate, but also a litany of state and local races across the country. I'm just going to begin by giving some brief intros of our stellar panel and a note about format before handing it over to my colleague, Mitch Robertson, who will be leading the conversation tonight. We're delighted to welcome three experts, all of whom have deep backgrounds and experiences in U.S. politics. First, we have James Boyes, who is an academic specializing in U.S. politics and grand strategy. He's currently a visiting scholar at the Center for Strategic Studies at Tufts Fletcher School. Next is Kyle Kondik, managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball, the nonpartisan newsletter on American campaigns and elections at the University of Virginia's Center for Politics. And last but not least, we have Lindsay Newman, the head of geopolitical thought leadership, economics, and country risk at S&P Global, who previously was a senior research fellow with the U.S. and Americas program at Chatham House. So here's how this is going to unfold. Each speaker will give some opening remarks of about 5 minutes. Then we'll have a panel discussion for around 20. And finally, we'll open the floor to your questions. If you would like to ask a question, please write it in the Q&A function or just unmute yourself when you're called, and Mitch will select your questions and put them to our panelists. A last note before I hand it over, the entire session, including the Q&A, is being recorded and will be posted online on the department's website, our YouTube channel, and our podcast after the event. If you speak, you will be heard on the recording. We'll let you know when the recording is available, and we hope you'll share it with your networks. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Mitch.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and I'm delighted to be here with you all and delighted to hear from these three wonderful panelists tonight. So we might take them in the order that Thomas kindly introduced them. So James, would you like to take it away?
Thank you, Mitch. It's a real great pleasure to be here. And let me just start off by thanking Thomas and Julie and Mitch for organizing this, as well as to Kyle and to Lindsay for joining me. It's wonderful for me. I'm actually back in London. I've been living in Boston for the last 3 years, and I'm very much looking forward to having what I hope is a nuanced conversation about American politics. That will be a first for the last 3 years. It's very, very difficult to have a conversation of this nature in the United States at this time. And I should point out that what I want to try and do in the time I have is to try and address the strengths and weaknesses of both parties. I should point out that does not equate in any way to a moral or political relativism between the two parties. I stress that because having such a conversation in America at this time is not easy. People have been increasingly siloed, and that is a great challenge in any ongoing intellectual debate of this nature. And it's been borne out in the polling and the debates. The challenges that all of us in our line of work, be that academia or media, in terms of trying to convey a real sense of a non-partisan approach to American politics, that task has become much more difficult, I think. And so again, I congratulate the team here for bringing us together, and for all of you for tuning in and listening to this. And I hope that we can all get something out of this. More specifically, with regard to this election, this really should be a cakewalk for the Republican Party. If you look at the history of midterm elections in the second year of an administration, it should very, very clearly be a bad night for the Democrats. I'm sure we're going to get into issues of polling and politics and about the specifics of this race, but on a broad, general historical approach, one would be looking for a bad night, I think, for the Democratic Party. It seems to be borne out in a lot of the reporting and the polling that I have seen. Frankly, the Republicans have got quite an easy challenge on their hands. You focus upon the state of the economy, the state of President Biden's apparent mental health, and issues to do with crime in Americans' great cities, many of which, frankly, I can speak of from personal experience, have become no-go zones. I've tried to get around the country as much as possible since COVID restrictions have been lifted, visiting places such as New York, Washington, New Orleans, as well as speaking to people from other key major states across the United States. And they're all saying the same thing, which is, unfortunately, a lot of what is being reported in the press about the state of democratically run cities is true. So it's very clear why and how the Republicans could run a very straightforward ticket on that basis. Unfortunately, they've also brought in a whole load of other issues relating to abortion, which is certainly, I think, unfortunately, from their point of view, made their task a little bit more complicated. I'm going to stop at that point and hand over to, I think, perhaps Kyle, and welcome everybody. It's great to see you.
So just as a little aside here, I actually had breakfast with the UK ambassador this morning, Karen Pierce, just in kind of a funny coincidence. And she is an incredibly impressive person, and so I enjoyed that. But we were over there, me and some other analysts, just talking about the election. And to James's point, there's the midterm election in the United States is historically just a referendum on the White House. There are some occasions over the years where there have been sort of extraordinary circumstances, and the president's party has done well in the midterm. Most recently, 2002, George W. Bush and the Republicans gained a little ground in the House and the Senate, sort of breaking historical trends in which the president's party usually loses ground in the House and the Senate. But that was the first election after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Bush's approval rating was quite high. It was also in the lead up to the Iraq War. It was a extraordinary circumstance. This time I think that kind of felt like we might have some extraordinary circumstances, specifically because of the Dobbs abortion decision back in the summer, and also just kind of some problems with the Republican Party nominating weak candidates in a lot of key Senate races, and also just being tied to Donald Trump, who's sort of a polarizing figure, although not as unpopular in America as I think is often expressed. Sometimes, like, let me just give you an example. Trump is doing a series of rallies across the country, and one of them is in Pennsylvania, which is one of the premier swing states in U.S. politics now. And I was talking to a reporter yesterday, and they were saying, "Oh, well, isn't it difficult or bad for Republicans to be seen with Trump right before the election?" And I said, "Well, Trump won Pennsylvania by a small margin and lost Pennsylvania by a small margin in 2016 and 2020. It's not like he's completely toxic in the state. I mean, his numbers are not great, but neither are those of the sitting president. It's also kind of unusual for the former president to be as prominent as this one is. Usually when presidents leave office, they kind of disappear, or they're not as much involved in partisan politics. Like Barack Obama's out doing campaign events and whatnot, but he's not very involved in the day-to-day the way that Trump has been. So there were some confounding factors, but ultimately, I think as we get near the end here, this is sort of unfolding as a more ordinary midterm, kind of similar to 2006, 2010, 2014, 2018, all years where things broke against the White House party. Happy to go into some of the specific races if there's interest in that. But I think at this point, expect the U.S. House to have a Republican majority, maybe somewhere between 230 and 240 seats in a 435 seat chamber. Republicans have 213, or they won 213 seats last time. Senate is 50-50. Vice President Kamala Harris breaks ties, and so the Democrats functionally have a 1-seat majority. Best guess, thinking Republicans get to 51 or 52 seats, which obviously would be enough to win the majority. Anyway, that's my baseline expectation. We do our projections at our Crystal Ball newsletter. The final ones are going to come out on Monday. So centerforpolitics.org/crystal ball if you're curious to see what we put out and how right or how wrong we end up being.
Thanks, Kyle. I'll pick up what you put down, and thanks to Mitch and to Julie and to Thomas at UCL too, including me in this important conversation alongside Kyle and James. As Thomas said, my day job is in geopolitics. So when I look at the U.S. and the current election cycle, it is through that lens. With that in mind, I thought I'd put down 3 markers that perhaps we can come back to in our Q&A session. The first is what this election means as a barometer of the overall health of U.S. democracy. In 2020, the last national level election that was held in the U.S., the key question was how to conduct an election in the middle of a pandemic. And the answer there we found was voting early, voting remotely using the U.S. Postal Service, any way that one could, and as a last resort, then voting in person. And as we all know very well by now, this brought a fever pitch around conversations around election integrity and the freeness and fairness of the elections there. In the aftermath of 2020, the the election conversation sort of accelerated around those key same trends towards election integrity. And we've seen a redistricting process at the state level. We have seen electoral regulations come into force and imposition of tighter voter restrictions. And for 2022, there is a renewed focus again on voting in paper through the ballot process in person. Just last night, President Biden was talking about these issues in a state before the whole country, where he talked about the very future of the nation depends on it. And there's something else at stake here, which is democracy itself. Those are his quotes. So how are we going to be thinking about this cycle on November 9th, if we have any election results on November 9th, but from November 9th onward, do we see votes being disputed? What is the narrative around election integrity and the veracity of elections, electoral fraud going into the all-important election cycle of 2024? And because, as we sit here in the UK, we know that the world is watching these issues. The second, of course, is something that both Kyle and James have touched upon, which is what is the government actually going to look like after this election? What's going to be the composition? What's going to be policy making? As both Kyle and James had alluded to, the most likely scenario is, in fact, a split government with the Dems holding on to the executive and the Republicans taking one or both houses. And that's because, as everyone's really said tonight, these midterm elections tend to be a referendum on the current presidency, but also because the economy, which is always a leading issue amongst voters, is one again right now. The U.S. is facing persistent inflation, facing recessionary worries. So in this scenario that we see the Republicans holding one, or if not both of the houses, and of course the president still being President Biden, we have to expect we're going to see a lot more policy gridlock, a lot more sort of lack of progression of legislation, potential for government shutdowns, potential for debt ceiling fights. And this is going to set up limited opportunities for there to be bipartisanship. If we see any bipartisanship, it will be around issues like infrastructure, supply chain resilience, a very big issue right now, especially for U.S. national security, and of course on foreign policy. And then that takes me to my final point that I'll raise just now, which is around the U.S. in the world. So broadly speaking, the Russia-Ukraine conflict has hastened a confrontation with a host of geopolitical issues that we knew needed or warranted addressing in a sort of post-Brexit, post-Afghanistan conflict, post-Trumpian world. And this is really going to be a multi-year process. We haven't landed anywhere yet. It's going to be an ongoing process over the next several years to decade. For the US, the pre-2022 narrative was about a more inwardly focused US, a US that had perhaps lost its global footing as mainland China began to gain some ground, along with plenty of attention and concern, as I believe James already alluded to the polarization in US in the US electorate. And I'm sure we'll get into this more. But since Russia invaded Ukraine, the US has now sent more than $18 billion overseas to Ukraine since the President Biden's administration started in 2021. In January 2021. And this has really reaffirmed the US role as a leader in the global security space, at least. But what's interesting here is that we've just recently had the long-awaited national security strategy come out. This was a document that every administration is intended to put forward in their first year in office. This one was delayed because of the pandemic itself and because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The administration was having a rethink. And what we see in this document that has now been released is the US administration is focused on the twin challenges of reshaping the post-Cold War international order and a set of shared challenges like the climate agenda, energy transition. And perhaps the most revealing line in that document is where the administration says, we have broken down the dividing line between domestic politics, domestic policy, and foreign policy. And this is really a philosophical shift that is taking place with US policymakers. It's not just this administration, we saw it through prior administrations, to tie what's going on abroad with what the impact is at home. And it's about connecting economic policy and national security. It's about, as I've already said, the supply chain resilience point. It's about a renewed conversation around industrial policy. We're seeing all this. It looks like the US CHIPS Act. It looks like the IRA. It looks like this recent imposition of export bans on semiconductors. So what will this election and certainly the next election mean for how the US orients itself in the world?
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for those great starts from our three speakers, which I'm sure will have prompted a lot of questions and a lot of thoughts from our audience. So I've got a couple of questions for our panelists, but please do either raise your hand if you'd like to be on camera. As Thomas said, this will be recorded, or if you would like me to read out the question, just put it in the Q&A, and I'm glad to read those out. My first question, I think perhaps, is to Kyle, thinking about, with your work with the Crystal Ball Project at UVA, what are some of the key races and what's the state of some of those key, perhaps, Senate races at the moment?
Yeah, I think most people are focused primarily on three key races. Pennsylvania, which is an open Republican-held Senate seat. That's with John Fetterman, Democratic Lieutenant Governor, versus Mehmet Oz, the television doctor, on the Republican side. Georgia, where Senator Raphael Warnock, who won a special election back in an early 2021 runoff, he's running for a full 6-year term against Herschel Walker, who is a political newcomer and a former National Football League star. And then Nevada, where you've got incumbent Democrat Catherine Cortez Masto running against Republican former state attorney general Adam Laxalt. I mentioned Laxalt's background, a former elected state attorney general, so statewide elected position below the level of governor, because he's really one of the kind of non-incumbent Republicans running this year. He's one of the few who actually has formal elected experience, or has even run for office in the past. Oz has never run for anything before. Herschel Walker has never run for anything. Blake Masters, a Republican running in Arizona as a challenger in another key race, he's never run for anything before. In Ohio, an open Republican seat, J.D. Vance, author of Hillbilly Elegy on the Republican side, he's never run for anything before. So there's a lot of newcomers on the Republican side, and some of these candidates I don't think have performed that well, but many, if all of them, may still end up winning, in large part because of the political environment. But it does show, I think, that on the Republican side, there's just more of an appetite and more of a desire to elect, or to have people running who don't have past elected experience. The Republicans are the anti-government party. Donald Trump is really still the leader of the party. He's the first president ever who did not have either formal elected experience or military experience. Like, Dwight Eisenhower never ran for anything before president, but he was supreme commander in Europe, which has got to count for something. But Trump was a real outsider, at least from the elected sphere, and you're seeing that in a lot of these races. I just think at the end of the day, a lot of these races seem like they're kind of breaking toward the Republicans at the end. If you look at the polling, again, the polling is like, the longer I do this stuff, the more skeptical I am of the polling, even though I'm grateful to have it. It's common in the United States and probably in the UK too to, whine about the polls, but then also say, oh, well, we need more polls. And, we expect the polls to be perfect. And of course, that's an unfair expectation. But I'm trying to think, there's that line from one of the Woody Allen movies, that the joke, it's like, yeah, the food here is terrible in such small portions. Too. What people feel about polling. Georgia is different. Of course, we've got this federal system in the United States. The states are, laboratories of democracy and all that, all the cliches about the US. And so different states have different rules about these things. Georgia is a runoff state, meaning that, if nobody gets over 50%, you got to move on to another round of elections. Most states don't have runoffs. A handful do, mostly in the South. And, of course, we had two of those in Georgia in early 2021. The Democrats ended up winning both of them, and that allowed them to win control of the U.S. Senate that year. It seems possible that Georgia will go to a runoff again. This time it would be in December. The law has changed there. So at least we'll get things wrapped up a little bit quicker than we did in the 2020 cycle. But there's still a path, I think, for either candidate to win on election day. Best intel I have is that race is moving a little bit more toward the Republicans. In fact, you all may have seen Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer was on a tarmac talking to the president late last week, and he said, "Well, a lot of things aren't looking so great in Georgia," or something to that effect. And who knows how real that is? But I mean, it is the Senate Majority Leader talking to the President of the United States. I mean, you'd think that they would be keyed into these things. So, and Pennsylvania, I mean, Fetterman's been leading the whole time, but I think that race is basically tied. And I think you could maybe argue that the momentum is maybe a little bit more toward the Republicans in that race. And this is why I'm saying, I said before, I think Republicans are likely to win the Senate. And the trajectory of these three races is a big part of the reason why.
Mitch,
Excellent.
perhaps I could jump in at that point
please.
a little bit, because
Please do.
I think one of the challenges when we talk about the midterm elections is there's understandably a focus upon what's going to happen in Washington, D.C. with regard to the makeup of the Senate and the House. But one of the things, and I'm sure Carl would agree with me here, is that there's also a series of key gubernatorial elections going on across the country. And those are of great significance. If for no other reason than in many states, the idea that once you control the governorship, you control the infrastructure within that state, which can then control how it is that elections are held within those states. And you, in many states, have a degree of control over issues such as, redistricting. And redistricting is the big issue in this election. There's been a series of redistricting events which have occurred across the country, in particular in places like Florida, for example. So, that's going to change how and why people vote. My friend Brian Klaas has done a lot of work on this. And if you look at some of these, congressional districts, you would think they'd been drawn together by, some sort of drunk imbecile, quite frankly, because they make no sense whatsoever. They seem to defy logic, which just defines a lot of American politics, quite frankly, at this time in space. But the idea that if you look at a lot of these these gubernatorial races, you're going to see some interesting results. There's a lot of focus, for example, amongst the Democratic Party about trying to turn Texas blue. They try to refer to it as a purple state at this point for a whole variety of reasons. But again, I think that if you look at how that race is panning out, where Beto O'Rourke is challenging the incumbent Governor Abbott there, for example. If you look at Georgia, where Stacey Abrams, for example, has been touted for a long time as a key figure within the Democratic Party, I just don't see either of those two Democrats on a path to victory at this point, for a number of reasons, both of which have to do with issues of incumbency and across the board, both at the gubernatorial, the House, and the Senate level. I think the ultimate victor next week will be the incumbency, because anybody trying to overcome an incumbent is onto a very, very difficult challenge from the very start, quite frankly, for a whole variety of reasons to do with name recognition, fundraising, infrastructure, the ability of the incumbent to play the deck effectively to help them and to issue policies that will aid them once they're in office. I'd also point out, I think, that the Democrats have this very strange policy at the moment, which is, hey, you didn't win an election 2 years ago to become a member of the House of Representatives. Your reward is now you get to run for governor, which seems to defy logic to me. We've seen this with Beto O'Rourke in Texas. We're seeing it with Stacey Abrams. We saw it 2 cycles ago with Amy McGrath in Kentucky. These are smart people who I'm sure should have a future within the Democratic Party, but it's difficult to see their route to power in their individual states, in either in Texas or in Georgia or in Kentucky in McGrath's case. And one of the challenges with this, of course, I think, is that you're seeing smart people in key states losing, whilst the idea that Dr. Oz could win a seat in the United States Senate would seem laughable only a few years ago, but then so would a Trump presidency. So we are, I think, seeing a very, very strange time at this place. But my last point on issues to do with polling, I think, is, both in the United States and Great Britain, there's this concept of the shy conservative voter. And time and again, you've seen polling which has underplayed polling figures from the right. People don't seem to want to admit that they're Republican or conservative in the United Kingdom. It will be interesting to see how those polls play out and whether there is that sort of 2 to 3%, which breaks for the Republican Party that perhaps isn't being shown up in polling at this point.
Mitch, if I could just pick up on polling
please,
just briefly, just the last bit of polling. I mean, there's no doubt that polling is going through sort of a great rethink. It's got growing pains for the sort of modern era of, social media and technology and, all of that. We're doing a lot of our polling in the same ways that we've been doing it for decades and decades. And I think that I was reading an article in 538 this week about how, the average polling margin is wide enough to swing us either which way. So, if the key here is that for the generic congressional ballot, for Dems to hold on to these houses, they need to be +3, just because of the institutional nature of how races are run, the federal system that Kyle was referring to. And I think at latest polling, the Republicans are actually +3. So it's, it's a difficult moment. And there has been this momentum, which we have a couple of questions touching on this point, but just picking up lastly on what James was saying, I wrote a lot about this in the run-up to the 2020 election. The Democratic Party has been facing this sort of division within its own, within the direction. What direction is it going to go? And I think as a result, there hasn't been a consistent message in this election cycle about where the focus should be. Whereas on the Republican side, there's been quite consistent messaging around the issues at hand. And the key sort of determinative issue, which I already alluded to, and sort of addressing some of these questions, has to be around the felt experience of voters right now with the cost of living crisis, with the price of energy going, the price of food going up, the price of gas going up. Money is just not stretching nearly as far as it did, say, a year ago. And Senator Bob Casey said, we should be pointing the finger also at Republicans for, the Democrats should be pointing the finger also at Republicans for the state of the economy. But in fact, Democrats have controlled both of the houses and the executive. So it's a hard sell. It's a message that's hard to sell. So even though, one of the questions that we had is how come, given all of these legislative acts like the CHIPS Act, like IRA, and there was others mentioned in the questions, all these massive legislative acts that have gone through Congress, the Democrats still find themselves in this position. Well, it's because of the felt experience that people are having right now, in the US on these issues.
And do you think to that point, there is something the Democrats could have done, or is that just the wave is going to hit them, the sort of wave of inflation and gas prices?
I think it's really tricky. I mean, there is this I think, election cycle after election cycle over the last, several decades, and Kyle could probably tell us how far it goes back. We have seen that there's a wave in these midterm elections against the party in power. So couple that with the economy, which is always a major weight. It's a really hard hill to climb, and I think that's why we've seen this shift in momentum over the last couple of months in particular, because there's been this narrative shift generally in the space around worries around the economy, worries around energy security, what's going to happen as we go into potentially a cold winter, a winter where the weather, something that none of us can control, will determine where we sit and where we land in spring on these major economic and commodity spaces, in these major economic and commodity spaces.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Just to Lindsay's point, every 4 years there, when a party loses in the midterm, there's always this internal thinking about, oh, we didn't get the message out right. We need a better message. We need this and that. And it's like, if it was just about messaging, it'd be easier for a party to get out of this. But there's just, there's just a lot of bad circumstances for Democrats in this particular election, just like there was for Republicans in 18 and Democrats in 14 and 10 and Republicans in 06. And again, not every election is a quote unquote wave, but it's just hard to be the president's party in a midterm, particularly when the president's numbers just aren't very good. I mean, that there's all sorts of little micro level things going on, but sometimes it's just helpful to just like take a look at the big picture. And big picture is just pretty challenging for Democrats, and it's been obvious for a while. It's just that there have been little intervening factors that have sort of clouded the picture. But I do feel like the picture, or the picture, is clearing up a little bit.
Do you think whatever the outcome is on Tuesday, does that read something into the tea leaves for 2024 for the Democrats?
I would say no. Midterms are historically not predictive of presidential elections. A lot of people maybe feel that way, and both parties, I think, have difficult questions to ask themselves about what they should do for their presidential nominations in 2024. But I don't. 2024 is just a different election. You got to reset everything.
Excellent, thank you. James, might come to you. I think all three of the panelists have said there's likely to be a Republican House and perhaps a toss-up on the Senate. What do you think will be the agenda of a Republican majority if it is elected next week? What are their priorities, and what are the possible pitfalls of those, I suppose?
Well, I'm going to address that, as well as that last question that you just put to Kyle, because I think they're related, which is that the Republican Party agenda will be to win the presidency in 2024. And that the way they're going to do that is by using their positions running the two chambers to do everything possible to stymie Joe Biden's legislative agenda moving forward. They've already been able to do that in many cases simply from their positions they already hold. So if they can compound that by taking the majorities in the House and the Senate, then they will do so. They will be looking to turn the tables on the January 6th committee by saying, right, well, we'll disband that. So there'll be no more January 6th committee once they take the charge. And they will be instead looking to hold hearings into what it is that Hunter Biden's been up to and looking into that. So just as for the last 2 years, from a Republican point of view, they will have seen a witch hunt going after Donald Trump. So it is now that Democrats, I'm sure, will be agog that the Republicans will be using the exact same platform to go after their president and what they will see as their weak link. We've seen a pattern of this. We're almost in a tit-for-tat retaliatory position. It wasn't that long ago there were the Benghazi hearings, which did a great deal, of course. They weren't held to necessarily embarrass Barack Obama as much as they were his former Secretary of State, one Hillary Clinton, who I remind everybody was running for the presidency at that point and was having to spend hours on end just holed up in front of this session trying to determine whether she did anything wrong in the lead up to those tragic events in Benghazi. So the extent to which the Senate and the House are being used in this sort of political prosecutorial perspective is something which we've seen over several cycles. They're clearly going to be looking to get whatever it is they can through in terms of legislation. From a Democratic point of view, legislatively wise, what they can claim as well, the president can at least veto legislation. And I think you're going to be seeing a lot of this, the Republicans passing legislation as they can through both chambers, some of which they'll be able to get through, some of which they won't, because of course they won't hold, a supermajority in the Senate. But what they can get before the president's desk, they will do so in an attempt to put Biden on the defensive. Are you going to sign this on the basis that, we, the people, have, we're here representing the will of the people? Are you going to deny that? And then basically choose a series of key policies upon which they want to fight the 2024 election and put Biden on the back foot. And of course, the results of coming up next week will have, I think, a determination upon who it is on both parties who are now going to start thinking about, well, I could replace Biden, both on the Republican and the Democratic side of things. If Trump's candidates, those he's endorsed around the country, do well, and clearly some of them will, he will claim, hey, it's still my party. I'm still the kingmaker. I should be the king. And will put his hat forward. You should look and see what happens in Florida, where DeSantis is clearly lining himself up for a potential run. And also, if the Democrats have a terrible, terrible night, if they have a blowout like they did in 2010, for example, when, of course, as Obama said, they got a shellacking. If you go back to Newt Gingrich's great success in 1994, which really turned Washington on its head. If the Democrats have a night that's as bad as that, then there will be severe calls for Joe Biden not to run again. Having seen him up close at the JFK Library recently, I can assure you that some of those reports about how he seems in person, his failing mental capacity, perhaps, it doesn't please me to say it, but when he gets lost on his own stage, if that's coupled with terrible polling results come election night in the midterms, then there will be calls, I'm sure, for him to reconsider his position at the top of the ticket.
Definitely. Thanks, James. Lindsay, was taken by comments about the health of US democracy and the sort of questions around election integrity. How likely do you think are we to see events play out a bit like last time, perhaps this sort of red mirage going into a blue wave, or a sense that, well, perhaps what's reported on Tuesday night may not be the final outcome? Do you think the American political system or the media is any better prepared for that, or are we likely to see the sort of give rise to these conspiracy theories?
Well, certainly we have to think that we're better prepared because we've been, through a couple of cycles of this now. Look, what we're going to see is certainly, there's going to be a process here in terms of when we have our results, what the outcomes are. Do I think we're going to see a red mirage? The polling is razor thin on most of these races, as Kyle's already, taken us through, and they have shifted quite dramatically just even over the last month. I refreshed my Real Clear earlier today, and Oz is up now. So just earlier this morning, it was still Fetterman holding on. So these are all very very close races, which indeed, of course, opens the door for sort of contested outcomes, or for sort of events that as we saw in 2020. But it's very hard to predict. As somebody who studied electoral violence, studied election integrity with for years and years and years, these sorts of patterns tend they tend to come election after election. So, there are plenty of discussion right now about what outcome of this election could sort of stem the wave of this sort of questioning of the elections and electoral cycles generally. And I guess we'll just have to see it in fact play out. But I'm struck by the questions that we're having about. We have a question here about what this all means for the UK, and I don't know if James perhaps wants to jump in on that, but I think the big issue that we're going to be watching into next year is how the US-UK relationship, how the transatlantic relationship, which we've seen revitalized as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, how that continues to play out. There are misalignments. There's always been misalignments within the EU itself. Now we have a UK out of the EU, but yet we've had this strong unity in imposition of Western sanctions on Russia. All this sort of defensive aid, security aid, financial aid, humanitarian aid has been coming from Europe and the US and the UK. Does that hang together, next year because of events on the ground in Ukraine, because of events on the ground in Europe with energy crisis and cost of living? But also, if we happen to have, as I think you were asking James earlier, what does a Republican, Congress look like? If we have a Republican Congress, we've already heard that McCarthy is saying that he'd look to sort of pull back aid on Ukraine. How likely is that? We've seen other Republican candidates say that they don't, they've distanced themselves from McCarthy's points of view. But these are big questions that are going to be we're going to have to watch unfold next year, but they're going to have a big impact into 2024. And I happen to, I certainly agree with Kyle that I started to get a little faint when James was talking about, I realized, oh God, on January 9th, we're going to have to start thinking about, November 9th, we're going to have to start thinking about 2024. But I think that it's a different animal looking at the presidential election, and midterm elections are, as Kyle said, they are what they are. They have a sort of a way about them.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that, Lindsay. And that's a good segue. I will pose that question to James there, but if anyone has any questions, please do post in the chat. We've got about 5 or 6. That's the end of the questions I had, and then so we'll roll in
ones. Oh, I've just lost my microphone at a very poor point there, but we do have a question for James. How will the midterms affect the UK?
It's a good question. I'm not entirely sure that it will have a direct result at this point. Generally these elections, midterm elections, generally have very little bearing or are poorly impacted by foreign affairs. One of the interesting things is that if I was living in Europe or studying in Europe and looking at the United States from overseas, I'd probably have a very, very different view of what was going on in America and what was impacting America than I do having lived there for 3 years. I'd be candid with you. I used to be in that position. I was an academic in London, and I would regularly pat myself on the back and think, I got a good angle on what's going on in America for a whole variety of reasons living in London. I candidly say, crikey, I was wrong. If you're not there, if you're not immersed in American society or there on a very regular basis, it's very difficult to understand what is and isn't impacting the American electorate, because you obviously see it from a European lens. And you say, well, of course, Americans must be worried about X, Y, and Z. And in many cases, they're not. These elections will tip on pocketbook issues. To quote Ronald Reagan, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? It's the economy, stupid. It's about how are people feeling about the economy and about, do they feel safe on their streets? It's a relatively straightforward campaign that you can run. What you don't hear a lot about is Ukraine and foreign policy, except in the idea that the Republicans are saying we're sending far too much aid overseas. And if we're prepared to dump billions of dollars into student debt relief, how can we do that and send all this money overseas to Ukraine? This isn't defending that position, but that's the argument that's getting put forward to people at a time of high inflation, increasing job insecurity, in inflation. The cost of living in the United States has gone through the roof over the last 18 months. It's a very, very difficult position for the Democrats to defend or to try and blame the Republicans. I think Kyle was talking about this a little earlier on. If you've held the White House, the House and the Senate, it's very difficult to turn around and go, well, it's the other guy's fault when it comes to the economy. And presidents have to run on the economy they have at the time of an election. And it just happens at this point, the economy is in a bad state. Biden's up for re-election in 2 years. The House has been controlled by the Democrats and Republicans. Those are the issues. And the UK, I can assure you, is not factoring into how it is that people are going to vote in the United States. And since, grand strategy is pretty much within the purview of the American executive, it's difficult to see how it is that these midterms are going to have an impact positively or negatively for Great Britain. I don't think many people think that Biden is a particularly firm friend of the United Kingdom, quite frankly. He's made a series of statements which seem to be suggesting otherwise. He's lukewarm on the position. He clearly isn't going to bother getting too close to this week's British Prime Minister. So I think that as a result of that, I'm glad I got a few smiles there. This is probably going to have no great role for the United Kingdom in this election or impact from those results. Far more so whatever happens in 2 years.
Can I just jump in though? I mean, I think, one point that is sort of the flip side of what James was saying earlier is that if there is a Republican Congress, then the president and the administration will depend more on executive action. So we'll be seeing them pull that lever. It's a lever that, has been pulled over the last several administrations quite a lot more than we had seen, in prior administrations. And I think that's something that will be a natural fallout of the Dems not holding both of the houses, and you still have a Democratic presidency. But I would just push back. I mean, we see the Biden administration relying heavily on the Quad, the quadrilateral security dialogue with India and the UK and the US and Australia. We see the formation of the AUKUS alliance as well. So the relationship between the US and the UK, I think, is stronger than perhaps we had thought it was going to be going into as we were talking in 2016 and onwards. I agree that the election itself may not have that much impact on that relationship, but I do think that and I think that's because that the president and the executive control foreign policy more so than Congress or certainly governor races do.
just to add one thing to what Lindsay said, one common thing to happen for a president when he loses, control of Congress, either one or both chambers, is that they sort of become more internationally focused for precisely the reasons that Lindsay says, in that they have basically more power to act on the international stage than they have on the domestic stage, because they can't get their agenda through Congress, but there are certain things that maybe they could try to do from a foreign policy perspective. I am not a foreign policy expert. I don't claim to be. One feature of the Biden administration, I think, has been that they wanted to focus a little bit more on, look east and look toward China and some of the issues to deal with over there. Of course, China is a rising power, and there are some important geopolitical questions about the future of Taiwan and other things. But because of events have sort of pinned the administration down in Europe, Vladimir Putin's aggressiveness, et cetera. But maybe you'll see more of a focus on the East and on China in the last couple of years of this administration, and just maybe more of an international focus in general, again, because that may be where the administration feels like they can do some things.
Thanks, Carl. While we're on you, we have a question here from John Newham. To what extent have the Republicans jeopardized their prospects by some of their candidates? I'd to know on to you.
I would just say that whatever look, if Republicans win 54 Senate seats, for instance, that would be a net gain of 4. That would probably mean that they won all of the most obvious targets at the start of the cycle: Arizona, New Hampshire, Georgia, and Nevada. If they do that, it would be hard to say that they really kicked away any of the races. And you could say that, well, at the end of the day, these lousy candidates didn't matter. That said, if they fall short of that, I think it probably will be at least because of weaker candidates in some of these races. So that's the number I think to watch is 54, because I think that's probably where the Republicans, quote, should be in this election. And then it's a question as to whether they get there or not. I also think that some of these races that we feel so unsure about, be it like Pennsylvania is a great example. If the Republicans had an incumbent running there instead of it being an open seat, or if they had someone who was a more credentialed person and a less polarizing person than Mehmet Oz, we'd probably be talking about that as the Republicans have it put away at this point. So, they've made life harder on themselves. It's just a question of, will it actually cost them seats? And so that's why I say the number 54, because again, that's what they should be getting if they had A-list candidates in all these races.
But I mean, to Kyle's point, I mean, the margins are so thin, right? Like if Fetterman holds on and wins Pennsylvania, the Republicans only need to flip 2 seats, right? And the races, as Kyle's already taken us through in Georgia and elsewhere, are showing are for Republicans. So the margins are just so incredibly thin to flip the Senate.
One of the interesting things I think to follow up on both Carl and Lindsay's point is the extent to which what the Republicans have done, and I'm going to quote Carl exactly, they've made life more complicated for themselves than they needed to do. And one of the ways they've done this is by primarying their own existing office holders through the MAGA wing, if we can call it that. And this idea, therefore, you've got the death of what I think of as the moderate middle. People are being targeted as being a rhino, whether that's the idea that we're talking about Lynn Cheney as a Republican in name only is utterly ludicrous. The idea that they've chased her out of the party and they've got to basically put someone else in that point, which brings the issue of incumbency into question. Look at what's going on with Adam Kitzinger, for example, in Illinois. The state I call home at the moment is a classic example. Charlie Baker is the epitome of a moderate, centrist, Republican governor of Massachusetts. He is very popular and would no doubt, I think, have won re-election in a cakewalk. He has been primaried out of this and decided not to seek re-election again. And so now all of a sudden the governorship of Massachusetts is up for grabs in a way that it wouldn't have been previously, because I've no doubt that Baker would have won re-election, quite frankly. So they have they've endorsed crazy candidates, some of which we've talked about, but they've also driven from the party that vital moderate middle, which is essential to try and get anything done, quite frankly, in American politics. And that, I think, is going to make life very, very difficult moving forward and helping drive the Republican Party unnecessarily to the right and abandoning the middle ground in American politics.
Yeah, not only have some of these folks just, been pushed out, but also some people who are logical people to seek higher office have decided not to do it because they basically don't want to be part of it. So a great example is Chris Sununu, who's the pretty popular Republican governor of New Hampshire. If he had decided to run for US Senate as Republicans wanted him to, he would have won the election, I think. As it stands, New Hampshire is actually pretty close. There's a much weaker Republican candidate, a guy named Don Bolduc. It's possible that Bolduc ends up winning, in which case you could say Republicans didn't lose anything by having Bolduc as the nominee, although would the country be better off with Chris Sununu in the Senate or Don Bolduc? I think it's reasonable to argue that Sununu is the case, although different people have different opinions on that, and that's fine. But that's, when I say judge it by 54 seats, New Hampshire is one of the big ones I'm talking about, because I still think Maggie Hassan, the Democrat there, remains favored. It'd be a surprise to me if Bolduc ended up winning. Sununu wouldn't have been a surprise at all if he would have won. And, you've got him and Larry Hogan, governor of Maryland. He could have run for Senate. Maryland's a super Democratic state, but Hogan probably would have been pretty competitive in a year like this. Doug Ducey, the outgoing governor in Arizona, if he was the nominee out there, he'd probably be in better shape than Blake Masters is. Masters may still end up winning again. So don't, let's not automatically say that these guys are going to lose these races. It's just that I think the Republicans would be in a better position if these folks had run. And also from a governing perspective, they would probably have more adults in the room, and Mitch McConnell would probably have an easier time of it if and when he becomes majority leader again, corralling a caucus that included Doug Ducey and Chris Sununu as opposed to Blake Masters and Don Bolduc.
Thanks, Carl. I was wondering, I don't know how much you've looked specifically into Georgia, but do we see, are there voters Republican voters that say they won't vote for Herschel Walker, or is the nature of polarization that the Republican voters are going to vote for the Republican, the Democratic voters are going to vote for the Democrat, and actually the names on the ticket don't matter that much?
I mean, I think that the latter is what the case is. I mean, I think that voters are approaching this in kind of a more parliamentary, kind of party-centered way, in that they identify, who they want the majority party to be, and the identity of the person actually matters less. I mean, there are a lot of voters who say that, I vote for the person, not for the party, but I think a lot of them are blowing smoke and lying on both sides. And so this is part of the reason why, there's this, on one hand, you can say there's this candidate quality crisis on the Republican side. You can also say that candidate quality is a metric, and things like incumbency matter less than they used to in this sort of party-driven world we're in, either voting for the party you like, or a term we call negative partisanship, voting against the party you don't like. And so the Republicans have actually picked a pretty good year to run a slate of bad candidates, because bad candidates could end up doing quite well anyway. But again, that's one of the big reasons why there's still some hesitance about the Senate flipping. It's just that a lot of these races are right on the razor's edge, and the Republicans have not had great candidates in these races, and that's contributing to why they're so close.
But I mean, I think that the issues do matter, right? And that's why we saw sort of a groundswell in the summer towards the Democrats, and we've seen sort of a return back to the Republicans. I mean, I wonder what Kyle thinks about that. I just think that the issues that matter right now, the issues that are most biting, some of the ones I've been saying, some of the ones that James said earlier, is just the felt experience of seeing that your wallet does not go as far, and seeing that at the gas pump you're paying more. There was this moment where gas prices had gone down, they've come back up again, and it seems like that's going to be the direction of travel. I'm not an energy forecaster, but that seems like potentially the direction of travel, or at least the worry that the American voters are having about that's going to be the direction of travel.
Yeah, I feel like the sort of issue matrix that people are thinking about, it's more on what you're talking about, and more of a focus on basically the issues the Republicans want to talk about. Whereas back in the summer, it was maybe more of like what the Democrats wanted to talk about. And the president gives a speech last night talking about the state of our democracy, which is all, important, legitimate points. but I just don't think that's where the public is focusing. And I mean, you could say tisk tisk, and they should be thinking about that, and that's a reasonable thing to say. But it's not for us to decide what people actually are thinking about it. We're trying to figure out what matters to people and what they're voting on. And certainly the end here has felt more like it's being contested on sort of the Republican leaning quote messaging turf, which I think is important and telling about the direction of selection.
Excellent. Thank you. We've had another question come in that I'll paraphrase, perhaps best directed at Lindsay, but I'm interested in the other two panelists as well. How worrying is the emergence of election deniers in the 2020 race in both in Senate and local races? And I'll editorialize here and say Secretary of State races, but perhaps Lindsay, if you'd like to start.
I mean, it's difficult to talk about, but I mean, essentially what we're seeing here is a wave of races that are this issue of election integrity, this issue of the veracity of elections is very much at play, both from candidates and, at stake in the election itself. And it's just something that's going to play out over this election cycle. And, as it played out in 2020, it hasn't been resolved. We haven't, apparently the narrative hasn't moved beyond it. And, it's their efforts on all, their efforts to bolster the electoral process so these questions don't come up, their efforts to, redistrict and change the voting rules so that there's, plausibly clarity on the other side, so I mean, it's a conversation. It's a very difficult one that's happening on all sides, and we're likely still going to be in the middle of it this cycle and, potentially into the next cycle.
Either Carl or James like to come in on that point?
Yeah, just to say, I thought when Donald Trump has said many dangerous, outlandish, foolish, offensive things during his short political career, but I always thought that one of the most troubling was back in 2016 in that final debate when he was asked if he'd accept the results, and he said, "Well, we'll see." Even then, I thought, "Well, crikey, that's kicking the legs out under, everything that the United States holds to be true in terms of electoral integrity." And that has unfortunately had a spiraling effect, so that now it becomes, the norm in many ways for particularly Republicans, but not exclusively Republicans, to start talking about challenging electoral integrity. We've seen other people, Stacey Abrams, for example, has routinely called into question the electoral result that she lost last time round, and has suggested that she might lose again because of, electoral irregularities. And this is very, very dangerous. If you're going to play the game, you've got to accept the rules. And if you lose, it's, you shouldn't then turn around and go, "Well, I don't like the way it was counted," or X, Y, and Z. There's always been machinations politically by political office holders to try to make it as favorable for your party as ever. We used to call it gerrymandering, for a variety of reasons, but, redistricting, trying to make it as viable as possible for your party to win has long occurred. And again, I know that Brian Klaas has done a lot of work on this, but, if you look at what's going on now, you're moving beyond that. You get to this point where the truth has become a victim in American politics, so that you're getting electoral denials on both sides, more often than not on the Republican, it must be said. But people are now, almost like afraid to believe anything, or not sure what to believe, when the veracity of the election is being called into question. When you see the Treasury Secretary saying, "Oh, there's no signs of recession in the country," when there's clearly very clear signs of recession in terms of inflation, going on, et cetera, et cetera. This idea of the truth being at odds, we're almost through the looking glass in American politics in so many ways. And election denial is just one example of that. It's perhaps the most serious, but it's only one of a series of incidents in which I think the truth is becoming a victim in American politics today.
Just on a bit of optimism, I mean, we, not to reorient the conversation, but we did just have an election in Brazil, and, the President Bolsonaro took tack about the integrity of the election and all of that, and Lula won, and Bolsonaro stood down, even though, people did not expect him to stand down so easily. So there is, process to move out of these sorts of conversations. But
doesn't that say something, Lindsay? The idea that with respect, we're holding up Brazil as a bastion of domestic political ability in counterpoint to the United States, which of course for many years prided itself as being the defender of international political events, and would regularly send people like Jimmy Carter off to places in South America to make sure that the vote was counted properly. It seems to be an indication of how far the United States has fallen on that front in such a short time period that we have to have that conversation.
I mean, I would say that what we're talking about is the acceptance of a process of voting and a process of accepting the election results, and merely as a point, we've just seen that in Brazil. We have seen it across many elections in the U.S., and we're certainly likely to see it across the elections in the U.S. in this cycle as well.
Excellent, thank you. And we'll move to a question from Ivan, who is a recent UCL alum. So I asked a couple of questions, but one might particularly be interested in is the effect of, I guess, either the January 6th, the storming of the Capitol, or the January 6th hearings, if we've seen any evidence of that playing any role in this midterm election. Maybe Kyle, and then if either James or Lindsay would like to jump in as well.
It doesn't seem like it's had that huge of an impact. Now, look, I think that the Republicans, with certain voters, particularly a group of voters who may have at one time been Republican, think the Republicans have lost a number of those kinds of voters. A lot of people who may have high levels of formal education, maybe live in affluent, highly educated suburbs, et cetera. Republicans have lost ground with some of those folks, and I think the continued obsession with Trump and his lies about 2020 and the horrible thing that happened on January 6, 2021, those are the sorts of things that maybe keep those people away, maybe in a world in which the Republicans sort of move on from Trump, maybe they get some of those people back if you just keep the conditions the same. And this is a bad election for Democrats and bad circumstances, et cetera. And so, there are kind of radicalizing elements of the Republican Party that I think have pushed people away and probably keep them away. However, I don't think it's enough to change the basic trajectory of the election. And so, again, I always say this, like, I wish we could run elections as like laboratory experiments, and we could sort of change the variables and say, oh, let's run 2022 in which Trump is impeached and is forbidden from running for office again, and how does that impact things, and this and that. But you can't do that. We only have this one election to run, and those are the circumstances. And so we just kind of have to speculate. And, my guess is that for a variety of different reasons, the Republicans are probably going to leave a little bit of meat on the bone in this election. However, I still think they're in pretty good shape to do pretty well in the House and to flip the Senate. And so, it's not like you can look at Republicans and say, oh my goodness, we have to change course. Like, they're going to be in the midst of, I think, feeling like they had a good election. It's easy for people like me to say, oh, well, you should have done better. Well, who cares? And also, I think that we've been sort of waiting to see if the Republicans would ever pay some sort of horrible price for giving their party to Trump. They have not paid that price. And, so they're not going to feel like, hey, we really need to change course here. I mean, yeah, they lost in 2020 and lost the House and the Senate, but the margins were pretty close. And Trump was basically able to skate by lying about the election, and he got away with it. He could have easily been impeached, and if Mitch McConnell had decided to support impeachment for the primary purpose of preventing Trump from ever running again, because that would have been a vote after conviction. It would have been by a simple majority. The Senate could have prevented Trump from running again. It's like in Lord of the Rings, where the elves wanted Isildur to throw the ring into the fire, and they didn't do it. And so here we are. But the thing is I don't blame the Republicans for not doing that, because they feel like, I think they feel like their party is stronger now with Trump than it was before Trump. And actually, that's not that crazy of an argument.
Well said.
I like that. The equating Trump to Sauron. I like that. I think that in a world where academics and intellectuals and think tankers would prevail, January 6th would have had a key determining impact upon the election this year, because you'd look at it and you'd focus it and go, well, of course it's going to impact the American electorate. Look at the evidence that's being put forward. Look at how slickly they have produced this. They have gone out of their way to avoid the kind of boring, tedious, grandstanding speeches that these events usually deteriorate into. They should be, given some credit for that. They have tried to make a media 21st century approach to how to present evidence to the American people in prime time. Of course, it's going to make an impact. But, as we've been discussing throughout this evening, the polling suggests otherwise. There's no evidence that I can see, frankly, that the January 6th event has done anything except exacerbate what I call the siloing effect in American politics, which is that personalities, policies, and a pandemic have just driven the American electorate into their two silos ever more. And the people who are watching the January 6th hearings are, I think, predominantly Democrats who already agree with whatever results they're going to come out with before they've been produced. The Republicans are probably not watching it because Fox aren't carrying the hearings in large part. So, guess what? It's merely going to be continuing this push into separate camps and doing absolutely nothing to bring American together, even around an event which should be as universally decried as an assault upon democracy that we saw on January 6th. And if it had been, I think that would have been borne out in the polling and certainly the kind of feedback that Kyle and his colleagues would have been getting, frankly.
Absolutely. Thanks, James. Lindsay, would you like to come in and anything on that, or?
No, I think we covered it.
Wonderful. Okay, so we've got a question who's come in from UCL's own Alan Renwick, who's asked if the panelists could speak a bit more, please, about the health of the democracy in the US and what is the path back to a less polarized politics, with stronger losers' consent. Maybe
I can pick it up. I mean, look, it's difficult to watch. I mean, the polarization over the last several decades, the polarization over the last couple of years, watching the pandemic, seeing polarization just within the pandemic, it is very difficult to watch. It's somewhat like a Rorschach painting where I see one thing and you see a totally different thing, and there's no sort of seeing across, as James was sort of alluded to. And I don't have an answer to it because obviously if I did, I would be happy to be part of the solution. But I think there's years ahead, but this is probably not the answer that Alan or others are expecting. But I have 4 children of my own. I think it's our children. I think the way I'm watching my children be raised with inclusivity and sort of that perception of, of diversity and all of that, I think that's the way forward. And we maybe, we don't want to wait another generation for this to ease, but I just have to believe that the way that, I watch, my children, but also just, the activism we see on social media, all of that. I mean, I grew up in a time where I actually met President Bill Clinton at this is going to totally date me, at a Rock the Vote event for MTV, trying to get out the vote. I wasn't old enough to vote. I don't know why I ended up getting to invited to attend the event. So I'm not going to totally date myself, but it was a moment where there was concern about the level of the level of involvement, the level of excitement about the younger generation in politics, and we saw that again under Obama as well, and I think we're going to see it again. I have to believe that we're going to see it again, and that will involve these sort of ideas of coming together. So perhaps not the expected answer, but that's the hope that I have.
An optimistic one, James.
Yeah, I too met Bill Clinton when he was president in the summer of 1995, and I've been dining out on that event ever since. So. What can I tell you? I wish I could give a more positive answer to this, because it is a very depressing time, unfortunately, to be a student of American politics. I grew up in the United Kingdom and always viewed the US very positively. My political heroes were John F. Kennedy and Bill Clinton, and unfortunately, there are no signs of a Kennedy or a Bill Clinton-esque figure on the horizon in the United States at this time. Both parties, I'm afraid, are dominated by weak, elderly leadership, whether that's Mitch McConnell, whether that's Nancy Pelosi. There is an entire generation who are being driven from politics who should be the next generation of leadership, effectively. They're not coming through. They're not going to be able to inspire the young generation who are essential to get involved at the grassroots. Lindsay was rightly talking about the Rock the Vote movement, which was of a significance in the 1990s. The problem is, therefore, you're getting older and older people involved in politics. That's basically ensuring that only older people are getting involved in politics to a certain extent. And the problem is that this is creating, again, this silo effect that I'm talking about. Barack Obama famously said there's no blue states and red states, there's only the United States. He was wrong then. He's even more wrong now. There not only are red states and blue states, there are great chasms within states between the urban and the rural electorate, which are driving the United States in further and further distractions and from one another. And there is simply nothing to be gained at an electoral level by doing anything except continuing this. There seems to be no votes in coming together and talking about unity because of the polarization of American politics, the increasing issues to do with redistricting that we've talked about, the power of the incumbency. It is unfortunately very depressing, and I hate to be the harbinger of that, but that on the ground appears to be what I'm seeing routinely up and down the United States.
Kyle, your weighing in and your possible Bill Clinton meeting story.
You get to take the tying vote, Kyle. You get optimism or pessimism.
I've never met former President Clinton before, so I have no comments to say on that. I think it's pretty easy to be pessimistic, and frankly, I wouldn't blame anyone for being pessimistic. I get this question a lot, and I'm personally pessimistic. The one saving grace for the United States is, first of all, I think historically the United States is a pretty lucky country based on geography and other things that we're not surrounded by powerful enemies. We've had a great amount of diversity, and also fundamentally for the country's whole history, and I think this still continues to be true in a way that it is not true so many other places, is that there are lots of people who live in other places in the world who really want to live in the United States, and people still find the United States to be a very attractive place, and I understand why they feel that way, given the great opportunities here for many people, certainly not for everyone, and also I think that we still have horrible problems, I think, with race and other things, but I also think you could point to history and say that some of those problems have gotten better, that the country's getting more diverse, and is maybe figuring out ways in which people can sort of live together to the point that Lindsay was making, and particularly about the next generation in that way. That is there's still a kind of a fundamental strength, I think, and sort of stickiness of the United States and some of the ideals behind it. I just worry about some of that stuff falling by the wayside if people just let it let it happen.
Wonderful, thank you. Now we are nearing sadly to the end of this event. I just thought if maybe I can ask all of you, or any of you have something that we should watch out for on Tuesday night. If we're Tuesday night, I guess, what's that, Wednesday morning UK time, if we're sort of watching the results come in, is there a race we should be looking at that's going to be a harbinger of what to come? Maybe Kyle, I'll start with you.
Just in general, so some of the states that are first going to be reporting are like Virginia, Florida, North Carolina, Ohio. There are a handful of key races in those states. Florida counts really fast, but Florida also looks like it's going to be really bad for the Democrats. There's nothing that is like super competitive and super determinative in Florida. So, if the results look okay for Democrats in that state, maybe that's like a positive sign more broadly, but I'm not really expecting that. And let me give you 3 numbers for the U.S. House just to sort of measure maybe what to think about. So 218, that's the number for the majority. 235, that's the number of seats that Democrats won in 2022. If the Republicans got 235, there'd be a net gain of 22. I think that'd be a strong night for Republicans, given they've already got 213 seats. And then the big number is 248, and that would be the biggest Republican House majority since since right before the Great Depression. That would be a net gain of 35. That would be like, hey, this is a mega wave Republican environment. Could that happen? Yeah, I think it could. I'm not like, I do projections. I'm not going to project that to happen. But sort of keep those overall numbers in mind. And we're not going to know the precise tallies for a little while because California usually takes a while. There's some key House races out there. Pennsylvania probably going to take a couple of days because of the frankly stupid laws that they have there that forbid the pre-processing of some of the absentee ballots. The absentee ballots are going to be very Democratic leaning. So just like in 2020, if you're watching along that night, it looked like Pennsylvania was blood red. Just, wait till everything gets counted to make judgments about Pennsylvania.
Thank you. James?
Yeah, I would trying to build upon that. And again, sort of steer this in the direction of the governor's races. I think that, it'll be fascinating to see whether the Democrats can make any inroads into those governor's mansions that they don't already hold. I'm not looking for Democratic defeats necessarily, but if they were to make any gains, frankly, in any of the governor's races, that would be, I think, some small comfort because I'm envisaging, a disaster in terms of Washington, D.C. I think, a strong showing in the House of Representatives seems to be almost inevitable. I think a slight hold in the United States Senate. I think a 50-51, 52 seat majority for the Republicans wouldn't be unexpected. Frankly, the extent to which how bad the Democratic showing is will have a fascinating impact upon the White House, and the extent to which pressure becomes to bear upon Joe Biden. He is the de facto leader of the Democratic Party at this point. He cannot escape responsibility. His polling numbers are not good. He is constantly being challenged about whether he's going to run for a second term. He has stated that he will, but of course, I think in the aftermath of the midterm elections, if it is a blowout, if there are anything like the numbers that Kyle just mentioned, then he will come under increasing pressure to bow out. And then the question is, what does Kamala Harris do? She would then become the presumptive nominee. Would she be challenged? How quickly do people come out of the starting blocks? We are going to be moving, unfortunately, into the presidential cycle come Wednesday morning, whether we like it or not. The United States, I long believed, is better geared up for campaigning than it is for governing. And we're going to see examples of that because the presidential election begins in earnest. Let's wait and see what happens with DeSantis. Let's see what Trump says and what Biden says, because those are the three key individuals, I think, moving forward, who are going to dominate the headlines moving into 2023 and 24.
Excellent.
As I like to say, there's always an election in the U.S. We're always starting another cycle. I know we're at time, so I'll just say, be very interested to see what happens with polling, how well polling does, in the postmortem, and maybe not a Tuesday night thing, but the sort of deep analysis that comes out of these election results: who voted where, when, why, for which issues. Do we see, interesting cross-sectional voting, intersectional voting? I think that will be something that will be quite interesting to watch, especially going to 2024.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Lindsay. Now, just before we thank our speakers and sign off for the night, just to remind you that the next Policy and Practice event, which was as part of the series is titled The Impact of the War in Ukraine on Energy Geopolitics. So of interest to many of you, I'm sure. That will be featuring Professors Helen Thompson and Neil Morissetti. That's going to be on Thursday, the 17th of November, in person in London and also on Zoom. If you don't already, please follow the Centre on US Politics on Twitter and Instagram at UCLSPP. Oh no, that would be the Policy and Practice one. Sorry, that's UCLSPP. We announce all of our forthcoming events there and also be able to keep up with all the latest research that's coming out of that great institute. So once again, thank you very much to Kyle, James, and Lindsay. Thank you for sharing your insights and your time on this Tuesday evening. And thank you very much to everyone who's come along tonight. Thank you very much. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.